Hi, welcome to the Political Forum. Tonight we're going to have a discussion on a book entitled Why Liberalism Failed by Patrick J. Deneen. Hopefully most of you had a chance to check out the book. Here's a copy of my book. It's an audiobook that I had downloaded. Tonight we're going to have Earl Smith, who is going to give us a presentation and an overview of the book. And then after the presentation, then we're going to open it up for Q&As, where I will start the questions and answers, and then I'll open it up to the audience. So at this time, if you could please put your audio on mute, I would like to introduce you to Dr. Earl Smith II. Let me introduce you a little bit more about Earl. He's a political and social theorist with a PhD from the Department of Government at University of Glasgow in Scotland, and a Master's of Management Science from the Sloan School of Management Science at MIT, and a bachelor's degree in business administration from the University of Texas. His first direct experience with political engagement was the Kennedy administration, and he has been involved since then in one way or another. Earl has supported Ross Perot in the United We Stand movement and the Scottish National Party, SNP, during the run-up to the referendum. He acted as a go-between connecting organizations like the National Conference of State Legislatures and National Association of Governors with the SNP in furtherance of designing and launching the new parliament. Presently, Earl supports the Lincoln Project and Republicans for the Rule of Law. Welcome, Chief. Let me turn
Thank you. Much appreciated, and welcome everybody. I want to talk a little bit about this book. Can everybody see the slide?
Yes.
Okay, good. Patrick Deneen is a professor at Notre Dame, and he wrote this book, and it turned out to be very influential. There's a lot of other books that quote it and reference it. The book is an analysis of the creation and the final up to the final flowering of liberalism. So, but in starting, I want to talk about what liberalism is not. All right, liberalism is not any of these perspectives in the first column. It's not neoliberalism or progressivism or communism. These are all models of human society that came as a result of liberalism and came into existence within the boundaries of liberalism. Liberalism is not liberals or Democrats or Republicans or conservatives or any of that other stuff. These are all children of liberalism that occurred because of the nature and the internal logic of liberalism. And liberalism is not nationalist or internationalist or any of these other ones. Those are global perspectives that exist within the framework of liberalism. So what is liberalism? Deneen is not writing about petty political feuds. He's not writing about why liberalism or liberals or globalists failed. He's thinking about the experiment that was launched in what was called the long 18th century, which generally is recognized as beginning around 1685 and going through 1815, where the age of reason and the Enlightenment came into being. So liberalism is a theory of political, social, and economic organization. And it's based on the work of some of these people that I list here. I say it's based on an evolving and selective reading. As an example, Adam Smith wrote two books of note. One, The Wealth of Nations, which everybody quotes and almost nobody has read. But he also wrote a book on the nature of human relationships, which nobody has either read nor quotes. So in the beginning, these thinkers had a much broader perspective than the subsequent interpreters of their work have taken. It since been cherry-picked. Liberalism was an attempt to replace the naturally evolving order with a system designed by human beings. By naturally evolving systems, I mean that feudalism kind of came into existence as a result of the internal dynamics of human society. The writers in the Age of Reason said, no, we can do better than that. Let's design a system which will produce an arrangement which is far better for individuals and humanity writ large. The last paragraph here is really important. Liberalism is a non-evolutionary construct. It's a creation of the thinking of writers during that long 18th century. So there are some foundational assumptions of liberalism. The first one is, you should recognize quickly, it's the opportunities for individual empowerment and development are best afforded by a government which protects the rights of the individual, free markets, and space for individual initiative and aspiration. The fundamental liberalism ideas that came out of the foundational writing. In liberalism, the political legitimacy is grounded on a shared acceptance of an originating social contract, and this is really important later on. Key to the writings of all of these men was the idea that society was bound together by a social contract, or what's called a commonweal, which turned out to be a commonwealth, and some of the states used that title. Under the idea of liberalism, if you came into a society and you subscribed to its fundamental social contract, then you became a member of that society in good standing. And that the tenets of that social contract were then continually reinforced by cultural norms and elections of representative government. Now, liberalism didn't remain static throughout its period. Classical liberalism, which is a liberalism based upon the writings of the authors that I've referenced, assumed that human nature is a fixed and irredeemable part of an evolving world. This is Machiavelli. Machiavelli said people are corrupt. You can't redeem them. You've got to fence them in. And he wrote about a government that provided the guardrails that kept citizens from following their baser instincts. Most of the writers in that period were Christians in the Christian sense of the long 18th century. And so they had this view of original sin and the fall, that redemption was the path to redemption was through confession, and that paradise was elsewhere and made by God. Around the early to mid 1700s, liberalism went through an evolution to what's called modern liberalism. And modern liberalism assumes that human nature is redeemable and an evolving part of an evolving world. By this time, Darwin had done his thing. There was a different view of human nature and human society. There was a more Buddhist view of redemption in the world. The transcendentalists and the American neo-pragmatists are good examples of writers who were heavily influenced by this view, that the idea of redemption was through action. You redeemed yourself by improving the lot of others and contributing to your society. And paradise was on earth and made by man. And if it wasn't paradise, then man was essentially screwing up and needed to be put back on a path. So what happened was, as an example, in classical liberalism, freedom had a particular meaning. Freedom was freedom from. And if you read the founders' writings in this country,
Okay, Earl, you're on mute. Please unmute if you can.
I don't know what happened. I didn't touch anything. I got muted. Anyway, let me go for this. The founders' definition of freedom was freedom from. And the idea here was that there was a distant tyrant and that citizens would band together in common interest to successfully oppose that tyrant. So freedom was a societal necessity in the classical definition of liberalism. Around the early part of the 20th century, the definition of freedom became freedom to, meaning it brought a different definition of freedom, and that definition flowered in the 60s. Freedom became the right to do as one pleased, what a person unilaterally decided, to be master of one's own destiny, to find your own way, even if you lost everything else. And freedom became an individual right. And this is an important change in the definition of freedom within liberalism. Again, the colonists banded together to be free, essentially of an absent father, the king. In the beginning in the 60s, individuals saw banding together as a reduction of their freedom. And so they sought to maintain their own hegemony over their life's course. And the social contract began to fairly rapidly disintegrate. So liberalism initially succeeded for a number of reasons. The first was it lived off the accumulated reserves of the prior system. Around the late 1600s and early 1700s, there were strong established cultures, communities, a sense of morality, virtues and taboos, and those were enforced mostly by culture or your tribe, your local rabbi or priest or elders. It also succeeded because technological advances made possible an entirely new kind of economy. The Industrial Revolution, the printing press, and later on social media, all of which added to the ability of individuals to disassociate and to disengage from the social contract. Ordinary life began to generate a surplus, and this is a radical change in human history. By the time we get into the Industrial Revolution, you could actually make a considerable surplus off the work of an employee. And the species began to move from a subsistence to the generation of a surplus. Natural resources, notably oil, which were underexploited, began to be heavily exploited. Education and information were democratized, particularly as Gutenberg's press distributed information. And the masses were educated and domesticated, meaning that by domesticated, I mean they bought into the basic premise of liberalism. It wasn't as if they were struggling against the dominant organization of their society. They participated in it with relish. So now we're going to get to the guts of Deneen's criticism of liberalism. In his book, he says that liberalism failed because it succeeded. That there were flaws in its internal logic, and once it began to flower, those flaws became manifest. It generated pathologies, as an example, narcissism, that are at once deformations of its claim, but also realizations of its ideology. Liberalism, in its core concept, is essentially arguing that narcissism is the proper state of individuals. Narcissism meaning that they have claimed for themselves the right to define truth, and that they engage in an aversion to cognitive dissonance and an addiction to confirmation bias. And the failure came in three sectors, or I call them the three legs of the stool: in the individual, in government, and in free market. So the individual, this is where the failure comes in the individual. The focus on the individual increasingly became the individual, what we call the monad. And monad is an indivisible and hence ultimately simple entity such as an atom or a person. A person who is completely isolated, disconnected from culture and societal norms, is reduced to their basic form. And that shift dissolved much of the social contract. A lot of that occurred during the 60s and 70s and 80s as generations of children went off to college and left behind their local neighborhoods, their towns, the customs, and got educated in a different way of looking at the world and themselves. A friend of mine refers to this as the balkanization of the individual towards the monad. The process that occurred was that individuals became increasingly disassociated from any cultural context. So if we look at that, what happened to individuals? Okay, they became narcissistic. They became anti-cultural. A lot of them were embarrassed by and are embarrassed by where they came from and the kind of quaint, neat methods of their families and local communities. They became anti-traditional. The idea is that an individual defines truth and defines what is relevant to their life. There's many books on the fact that they became isolated and lonely. That they became angry, and you can see that not just in politics, but if you spend any time on Facebook, you can see just how angry individuals have become. And they became addicted to nostalgic mythology. And Deneen describes this in some detail, but in a book called Fantasyland, Kurt Anderson describes how Americans became addicted to mythologies which have no historical context. In other words, they are made up nostalgias that once you look at them or try to take them apart, they just disappear. Individuals became very vulnerable to manipulation. And if you are interested in how individuals are vulnerable to manipulation, there's a documentary called The Social Dilemma. And the social dilemma describes how social media is essentially monetizing and manipulating all the users on Facebook and Twitter and all of the other platforms. One classic example is that if you're in DC and you Google climate change, you get all sorts of information about from the scientists and how it's a real thing, and all the reinforcement of the idea that climate change is real. If you're a resident of Casper, Wyoming, and you Google exactly the same words, you get it's a hoax, It's made up. It's a liberal conspiracy against the oil company. So if you're interested at all in how individuals are manipulated in the late stages of liberalism, I highly recommend that. I think it's on Amazon Prime. Then individuals became anti-fact, anti-truth, and anti-expertise. There's this wonderful poem that Kipling wrote called The Conundrum of the Workshops. And one of the lines, one of the verses is, "The tale is old as the Eden's tree and new as the new cut too. For each man knows ere his lip sash grows, he is master of art and truth." For those of you who are following, this is a lip sash, by the way. And the children of liberalism insist that they are the master of art and truth. They define what is true. And so truth became relative. Fact became relative. Alternative facts showed up in some of the press conferences of an administration. They also became intellectually limited because the idea that somebody knows something that you don't is an insult to your identity as an individual, because the individual came to see themselves as both omnipotent and omniscient. The children of late liberalism are emotionally unstable. They are easily stimulated into violent response. As liberalism flowered, then citizens became consumers. This country was based on the idea of citizens, but the market has reduced us all to consumers, and our value is actually defined within the market by how much we spend, how much they can get out of it. There were virtual communities that grew up in an attempt to compensate for the lack of cultural context, but they have proved inadequate. So it doesn't make any difference how many friends you had in Facebook. You were arguably better off when you had 4 or 5 in a neighborhood where everybody knew your name and looked out after you, where you had direct personal relationships. The third point is an interesting one. Difference became sameness. A friend of mine is fond of saying that everybody in America is different in the same way, meaning that your differences have to stay within certain bounds. If you step out of those bounds, you get slapped down. Individuals were monetized. I've already talked about that. Freedom became meaningless because the only freedom you have is the freedom that doesn't transgress on the guardrail, the borders that are set around you. And narcissism then flowed into something I call faux tribalism, which in the old days, a tribe meant that you grew up in it, you were born into it, you bought into its mythologies, you went through the rites of passage in order to become an adult. The elder men taught the boys how to be men in the society. The elder women taught the women how to be adult women in the society. But this faux tribalism has nothing of that in it. It's simply you sign up and you're part of a tribe, and you've got to show up and behave within certain bounds. But it's not really a social structure that supports an individual. And that went into what I call faux polarization. Whenever I get into discussions with people about how polarized this country is, my response is that if narcissism is the dominant characteristic of Americans, then polarism means that the monads all don't accept each other, and the best they can do is loosely connect together to form pseudo groups that look like polarization. But the reason that we are polarized in the United States is that we're all fundamentally narcissistic. Now, liberalism failed also because the Guarantor of Rights became much, much more powerful and intrusive. When Adam Smith and Mill and Locke were writing, they did not conceive of the incredibly vast list of rights that are now claimed by individuals, because individuals to them were members of communities that were involved in tradition and culture. But as liberalism advanced and the focus of the individual became more and more on the individual, the list of rights just blossomed. So Deneen's analysis says that liberalism leads to Orwell's 1984, to Big Brother. The reason is, let's say you are a member of a small group. Let's pick one that's not going to set off any fire. You're a Native American. I happen to be. And you have rights as a Native American. So what do? You call on the government to protect your rights. But then there's somebody else in another group. And before you know it, the government's being called to protect all these rights. Well, it needs power. And it accumulates power in order to become this guarantor of this growing list of rights. The third reason that liberalism failed was that the market came to interpenetrate all aspects of society, culture, education, religion, politics, identity, and value. This is something that a couple of the writers in the liberalism stream warned about. One of the ones was Karl Marx, who warned about this. More recently, authors who wrote about predatory capitalism moving into raptor capitalism. But when the original authors were writing, they never conceived that the market would get strong enough to become the dominant player in liberalism. So wealth then gained the ability to define value through its market power, and it's established the value of all else. Individuals and government were reduced to objects within the market. The idea you want to buy how much you want to buy a senator, you want to buy votes. The market then and the power of wealth was magnified through government, which was set up to guarantee rights, and I'll get to that in just a minute. But humans who created liberalism following Deneen became devotees in the temple of the market. That the market essentially took the whole thing over. So liberalism fails because a three-legged stool becomes a two-legged stool, and then eventually it becomes a one-legged stool. In the decades after the opposing government power, in the mid-70s, the wealthy did a different strategy, and they said, let's try to take over the government and take control of the rulemaking and enforcement functions of government. Citizens United was a very important success for them in the Supreme Court because it made political campaigns much more expensive, which meant that if you're going to run, you've got to get major donors. Organizations were funded for the sole purpose of reforming government. The American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEX, is a really good example of one that was funded by the Koch brothers. And they write legislation, boilerplate, and distribute it to state legislatures to get it passed. They provide the money to convince the lobbying, to convince the members of the legislature to adopt the legislation. And they fund organizations like the School of Government out at George Mason University, which is designed to produce graduates who support the effort of organizations like ALEC and the State Policy Network. Lobbying firms then began taking these boilerplate legislation and pushing it to the state level. They've been very successful at it. In recent times, the proliferation of voter restriction laws that have showed up in states all across the country were all written by ALEC, and they were all distributed by lobbying firms paid for by organizations like the Koch brothers. The wealthy took over one of the major political parties. For those of you who don't know John C. Calhoun, he was Jackson's vice president and went back to become a senator in South Carolina. Calhoun argued that the Constitution did not create a federal government. It just refined the affiliation, the arrangements between the states, and that the federal government should have no power. He was exhumed by George Mason. He was venerated and then vindicated in a weird way because the people behind the effort realized that instead of opposing the federal government, you should just take it over. So this is some of the inevitable results of liberalism's final flowering. Widespread dissatisfaction with democratic politics. And you see that on both political extremes. The idea that there's a drift towards authoritarianism, it's my way or the highway, a global distrust of globalization. There's a really interesting book called Winner Takes All, which is a description of the demise of the Clinton Global Initiative and the realization that there was a strong anti-globalization movement sweeping the country. The weakening of family and community, it's inevitable as individuals become more self-absorbed and self-focused. They tear away from those contexts. They see them as limiting. The commodification of culture now, it's on sale. And if somebody discovers a culture in Africa that has some neat thing about it, it gets commoditized. And people have no connections with it at all, start wearing the clothes or the hat. Mysticism, the next to the last one's important because Deneen argues that as liberalism advances and the individuals become true children of liberalism, they become addicted to mythologies, which are untested assumptions or truths, which if you look at them closely, they are on very shaky ground. And so if you come to believe, for instance, and there's some preacher who just said that God told him that Trump was still president, all right? That's a kind of mythology. And the mythology is not challengeable because confirmation bias discards anything which doesn't agree with what you believe in. Essentially, Deneen believes there's no way back. The nostalgia is an addiction with a diminishing high, which means that you have to keep finding more bizarre nostalgias to replace the ones that have kind of fallen apart. So all of these were unavoidable outcomes of the flowering of a liberalism experiment. I want to emphasize, liberalism is an experiment in Western Europe and the United States based on the assumption that humans can design a better way of organizing the economy, government, and individual freedom. So here's Deneen's alternative. I'm right close to the end here. And there are lots of books that are written taking off of his alternative. One of the more interesting one is called Liberalism Disavowed, which is essentially a history of the evolution of a new approach to government and citizen participation in Singapore. Confucianism, which is much older than anything that came out of Western Europe, sees human beings as fundamentally good, teachable, improvable, and perfectible through personal and communal endeavor. And the last part is communal endeavor is really important. Confucius essentially said that individuals are formed not only by their personal experiences, but by the guidance or through the guidance of the social context within which they exist. And so Confucianism teaches somebody how to be a more productive member of society. And its fundamental assumption is that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. The second part of Deneen's suggestion of an alternative is communitarianism. Communitarianism focuses on the community, the social importance of culture and the family. In the United States, the lead writer on this is Amate Etzioni here at George Washington University. And these two fuse into something called Confucian communitarianism. And this is a true Asian experiment now. This is not, it doesn't exist very much in Western Europe or the United States. But Confucian communitarianism is a rising form of political, economic, and social organization through much of Asia. The individual's role in society is more important than the individual. Fundamental idea, fundamentally in opposition to the ideas of liberalism. Injudicious or libertine behavior impacts the entire society. Again, fundamentally counter to the underlying assumptions of liberalism, that believes that individuals for pursuing their own self-best interests are not a danger of society, but the best part of it. And at the end, there is such a thing as a common good. Now, in the United States, there are groups of people, the libertarians are the most notable, who will argue that there is no such thing as a common good. All there is the good for a particular individual. In Asia, the idea is that all people are working, strangely enough, similar to the classical liberalism model, that they are banding together in common interest to achieve. And in Singapore, which is a community, an island nation based about 7 ethnic groups, if you've ever been to Singapore, the first thing you notice is that people are Singaporean first, and they're Singaporean second, and then they may be Chinese or Malaysian or Indian third. But the dominant characteristic is this affinity that they have for each other, and the sense that they're all in this together. Now, finally, I've just got a couple of thoughts on Deneen's book. It's a very, very important book. But Deneen is long on analysis and short on prescription. Now, what do you do about it? The Confucian communitarian thing is as far as he gets into it. So most people, and including Deneen, has admitted this in some interviews. He did a really good job of analyzing, but he didn't have a really good idea of how to get from here to some other place. There are two kinds of books that have come from this. One is an optimistic set of books, which thinks, okay, we're all going to now adopt some version of Confucian communitarianism. We're going to rediscover the fact that we're all in this together. We're going to find that the country has to band together to do well in the rest of the world. The other group, which the pessimists follow Kierkegaard in his book called Sickness Unto Death, and that is that we will fall so far behind following our individual rights while the rest of the world organizes, particularly Asia, organizes into coherent international efforts, that we will never recover. That group says that the American century is over and the Asian century has begun. I hate to end on a downer, but there it is. That's what I take away from the book. So if you have questions about specific ideas that were in the presentation, I'd certainly be glad to respond to them. Thomas, back to you.
Okay, thanks, Earl, for that presentation. I guess we could exit out of the shared screen mode. And what we'll do is
just a quick thing. I will make the slide stack available to you, and anybody who wants it is happy. I'm happy to have them have it.
Okay, excellent. So what we'll do is I'll just toss some questions at Earl, and then we'll just go back and forth for about 15 minutes. And then if any of you have any questions, comments, feel free to raise your hand using the app function, and we'll get the questions lined up. And before we get to the Q&A, I just want to clarify a few other points. I mean, the presentation was definitely informative. And for those of you who have not read the book, I just want to provide some additional context to which this book was written. So it was written in 2018. So by then we've had Brexit, the rise of nationalism, populism. We've had the Trump administration. So again, there were a lot of forces at play. And then I think this book certainly captured the impetus of the changes that we saw in the latter part of the last decade. The other thing that the author mentions is, according to the author, he thinks there are three types of modern ideologies: communism, fascism, and liberalism. Here we are as we stand in year 2018 or 2021. The first two ideologies have failed to some degree, although you can make an argument that it's making a comeback, or it's certainly morphed into another, some type of a mercantilism. Okay, fair enough. But according to the author, liberalism is the only ideology that is still in place and somewhat relevant. However, his theory is that just like every ideology, because it's a human, I guess, form of ideology, it comes to an end at some point. It has like a natural life cycle. And the author believes that we are at this crossroads where this period is going to end. So then the question is, where do we go? And the recommendations that Earl had astutely pointed out are some of the recommendations at the end. Just a couple other points I want to kind of bring out there before we get into the Q&A. Again, the title is Why Liberalism Has Failed. And I think when somebody just looks at the title only, they might think that it's a commentary on what we call progressives, I guess someone who would identify on the left in the American political scene. But obviously Earl went through lengths defining what liberalism is. So again, just keep that in mind. But if I had to offer like a subtitle to the book, to the publisher, I think the subtitle would be something along the lines of a case for traditionalism against or combating anti-culture. And if you do like a word search in the book, he talks about the word culture over 159 times. This guy is big on culture. Whether if you agree with that or not, we'll get into that later. But his idea, there are certain chapters where he says, boy, the days of Leave It to Beaver, those were the good days. Why don't we go back to that? This modern stuff with both parents working and, everyone is very individualistic is harming society. And that's one of the kind of the undertones that I got from it. And we'll certainly save our comments for later in terms of any critical comments. But I guess as we start off the discussion, I think the way how the American political division is always defined, or the parameters of our division, it's always the left versus the right, or the classic liberals versus the progressive liberals. What do you think about that, Earl? Is that the right paradigm for defining our class divisions?
No, I don't think it is at all. I think that if you look at human society fundamentally, let's say made up of humans, you have a common characteristic. And then as you go down the road, and start dividing it into various groups and subgroups, you get different words to describe it. So they may be Americans and Italians and Germans. And then when you look at the German people, they have certain characteristics. You look at the Italian people, they have some, and Americans, they have different characteristics. The question is, when you're analyzing something like liberalism, what level of those details do you stay with? And my argument with Deneen has always been, if you go too far down the granularity in terms of your description, you lose the fundamental characteristics of the contradictions within the logic of liberalism. So Republicans and Democrats can fight about the left and the right. All of that occurs within the envelope of liberalism. And it's occurring today because of the fundamentally flawed nature of the theory of liberalism. So again, if you're trying to understand at the macro level, at the 60,000-foot level, what's going on in human society and where it's likely to go, you want to avoid being distracted by these side actions. I think that if you go to the question of what is the fundamental characteristic of Americans that make them act as they do, I think if you go much farther than looking at the narcissistic tendencies, you get too deep in the weeds and you lose the ability to keep in focus what's actually going on. So I would respond by saying, hey, the alt-right, the alt-left, the center-right, the center-left are all fundamentally narcissistic, and that's the defining characteristic that actually liberalism promotes.
Yeah, and what do you think about this characterization? If we were to look at a very macro view, again, the book goes into lengths talking about Hobbes and John Locke and other Enlightenment philosophers. And I believe the author talks to, he mentions them in a very deferential manner, how liberalism is born out of this fact that due to the accidents of birth, because you can't choose where you're going to be born, certain artificial conditions and oppression, liberalism was the creation of trying to extricate yourself from bondage, institutional bondage, social bondage. And as time went on, according to the author, liberalism morphed into something else. It was very kind of individualistic endeavor. And then you saw this kind of a division or fissure where on the right, individualism was based on certain market principles, mercantilism, commerce, trade, etc. And then on the left, it grew into this kind of bureaucratic, administrative, what we call big government type of approach to society. And I believe what the author is saying is the problem with the current society is that you have these two machines that are kind of fighting off each other. On one hand, you have this classic liberalism, which I think is more like Edmund Burke style liberalism, which is AKA conservatism. They believe in free market and everything catering to the free market for the sole purpose of individual achievement. On the other hand, it's the big government. So they're just fighting over each other to stay in power, and it goes into this very vicious circle. What do you think about that characterization?
No, I think that's a misreading. I mean, what Deneen is arguing is that liberalism results in an expandingly powerful government, and that both sides are clamoring for the government to protect their rights. If you looked at the debate around the latest tax cuts, the arguments were that the government should not take money from the wealthy in order to pay for programs that are voted for by the majority. And so the tax reform package, or the tax giveaway, depending on how you define it, was promoted by individuals who are asking the government to protect their rights, which means they're asking the government not to take their wealth. or to let them keep more of it. If you look at the other side, you've got individuals as communities who are looking to have their rights protected. A good example is the baker who did not want to make a cake for a gay couple's wedding. And the argument was, I need the government to come in and protect my rights and keep me from being harmed by my refusal to do this. So Deneen is arguing at the base that liberalism, as it advances, creates a clamor from almost all parts of the society for the government to stand in and protect their rights. And his argument is that results in the government becoming more and more powerful, more and more intrusive, and more disconnected from the average citizen. So let's say you and I are part of a group and we petition to protect our rights. Well, we're just one amongst thousands of such petitions. And the government is farther and farther away from our real concerns. They are simply saying, oh, there's a right that you protect. We don't care what it is. We're going to protect it. And so Deneen's argument, which I advance in some of the writings I've done, is that government then becomes almost unconcerned with the nature of the right, as long as it's defined as a right.
Yeah, I think the theme of being unconcerned, abstract, disconnected is certainly one of the reasons why he's in favor of localism and certain types of communitarianism. But just going back to
I want to tee off on that for a minute. This is Etzioni's problem, the communitarian at GW. The American idea of communitarianism is almost always small and local. The idea of communitarianism in Asia is generally nationwide. So if you read Etzioni, he's always talking about these small communities. I don't know if anybody knows about Findhorn, but Findhorn was a community in Scotland that was bound together, and it's now 50-some years old. The Americans, when they think of this, think of small communities, and Deneen falls into that trap. What he doesn't really accept, understand, or consider sufficiently is that when you go to Korea, South Korea, or North Korea, if you go to Singapore, if you go to Taiwan, and if you go to China, their idea of communitarianism essentially is nationwide. So it's a matter of scale. The Americans are looking at the very small communities, and in Asia, communitarianism is a nationwide characteristic. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I mean, it's an important idea.
So just going back to that slide you had before, where when liberalism, flowers, I believe it was something like citizens become consumers, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
the book also talks about there's this kind of appearance of, purported freedom, meaning choice, consumer choice, but that's not the real freedom. Can you talk a bit about that and how that's different from this concept of liberty? Because I know freedom and liberty are sometimes interchangeable in some ways in a dialogue, but can you make that distinction?
Yeah, I part a little bit from Deneen on this. He uses that word liberty entirely too much for me, because I don't think it's easy to define freedom as freedom from or freedom to. And if you then say, okay, it's liberty from and liberty to, you might as well use the word freedom. Liberty is one of those psychologically charged words that everybody throws around. The don't tread on me guys. But when you look at the question of Americans moving from citizens to consumers, in the early days, and if you read some of the history, when Thomas Paine was writing his, the American Crisis, when Madison and Hamilton and Jay were writing the Federalist Papers, they would be distributed mostly through the religious networks down through the colonies and taken to pubs, and the person who could actually read them to somebody else. And citizens felt themselves as being engaged in their government. It was a relatively small population, relatively small geographic area compared to what it is now. And so citizens had this feeling that they had an impact on what was happening within the government. They became consumers when they lost that connection, when they essentially became one of the 250,000 plus individuals that a representative is elected to represent in their district. Then gerrymandering came along, and a whole part of the population, if you're in a democratically gerrymandered district and you're a Republican, you're disconnected. It's the same as true if you're a Democrat in a Republican district. But then the idea came in the 60s through the generations that had not really suffered under the Great Depression, that consumerism was the way to define your value. I mean, all sorts of radical ideas like the car you drove, the clothes you wore, the neighborhood you lived in. Madison Avenue developed this idea of manufactured demand. And the idea is that if you do it the right way, you can induce somebody to buy some crap that they really don't need. And so individuals became defined not by their participation in governance, but by their participation in the economy. And if you look at the American economy, a vast majority of it is driven by consumer spending.
Yeah, and also the book talks about the dangers of excessive debt and focusing on consumption, overconsumption, because it's a distraction and it breaks down communities. I want to read a passage from the book, and I think this really goes to the core of his, what I would call a cultural preservation in the name of traditionalism. And I want to get your thoughts on this. This is the part where he is, again, towards the end of the book, in conclusions, he is speaking in defense of culture against anti-culture. So he says, quote, "Liberalism is an unwitting inheritance. Culture is a deep form of generational consent. Culture and tradition are the culmination of practice and experience that generations have willingly accrued and passed along as gifts to future generations. This inheritance is a result of a deeper form of freedom and the freedom of intergenerational interactions with the world and one another. It is a consequence of a collective practice." What do you think about that?
Well, yeah, I think that Deneen's problem, and he's a churchman, is that he doesn't have a solution way forward. He doesn't envision it, a way forward which he believes in. And he's arguing in that passage for a return to a place that, at least in my judgment, you cannot reach. He talks about intergenerational relationships, but he's talking about a time in which extended families lived with each other. You took care of your elders. They passed on their accumulations to the next generation. They taught the next generation the history of the family. They taught the next generation about where they came from and what they believe. None of that exists. And Deneen in that passage is suggesting, and he doesn't argue it very forcefully because I think he doesn't believe it, that you can't put the genie back in the bottle. And that's what he's arguing to do. Let's go back to the days of yesteryear and leave it to Beaver, and everything will be peachy and keen at the same time. I saw a comment go by about Confucian Communitarianism as a proposed alternative. Deneen makes that suggestion because he's seen it work as an alternative to liberalism in other countries. He's looking at the question, okay, if liberalism is in its final flowering and going to its end, where we go from here? And one of the things he did was he looked around the world and said, okay, who's got the alternative going? Which ones look promising? And when he looked at Europe, and I've seen him interviewed on this, when he looked at Europe, he couldn't come up with anything there because it was they were all liberalism as well. So he turned then to Asia, and lo and behold, he found initially the Singaporean experience, but he found the South Korean experience, the so-called Seven Little Dragons, and he suggests, he doesn't insist, but he suggests that may be a way forward after the final demise of liberalism.
Yeah, just to
comment. Deneen is not very secure in his vision going forward, and he admits it.
Yeah, with whatever limited vision that he does offer in the book, he says, speaking of Confucianist communitarianism, he talks about some forms of self-governance through civic participation. Again, that sounds very lofty and well-intentioned, but how do you go about doing that? Also talks about emboldening communities and strengthening freedoms of associations. Again, all those are great. Join your local board of education or run for city council. But during this time of pandemic, we've seen the limits of local government. You do need some sort of federalism, or at least some national effort. So I think
I will give you an example of something that did attract his attention. In Singapore, for 60 plus years, one party has been in power, the PNP, the People's National Party. But politics runs differently in Singapore than it does in the United States. There have been several times when discontent amongst parts of the community have risen to the point where they supported a competing party. Now, what happened each time was that the PNP prevailed, stayed in power, but it took on board the criticism of the insurgents and modified its policies. So in Singapore, politics is a negotiation with the ruling party through the mechanism of competitive parties. And so over the period of about 5 generations now in Singapore, it started out very draconian in terms of its laws, has eased up considerably, and each time that has been a result of a rising discontent about this or that issue. The government prevails over the insurgent party, but then changes its policies. Now, if you talk to a Singaporean who was an advocate of one of those parties, they will tell you, yeah, that was my engagement. I had an effect. The government took on board what it was that we were discontented about. And so when Deneen writes about this whole question of join your local or something like that, he's writing within the framework of liberalism. This is the trap that he's in. He is a child of liberalism, and he's writing about liberalism. It is reflexive in Singapore to think about participation in a way I've just described. And citizens now in Singapore feel empowered and engaged and involved and impactful because they can join a movement in opposition to the government, and they trust that the government will take on board the legitimacy of their concerns and adjust its policies accordingly. So it's 2 different worlds, and the words mean something completely different in those 2 different worlds. Anyway, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. Although I'm not really sure if an example from a political system based on a city-state, i.e. Singapore, would necessarily apply to, a massive nation like the U.S. Not to mention, Lee Kuan Yew ruled with an iron fist, and a lot of his the laws that he enacted through executive action will not pass the constitutional muster. Even things like unreasonable search and seizures, it just will not.
John Burke famously said that he did not think a proposal for reforming political, social, and economic activity should be taken seriously when it's generated by a bunch of rubes in 13 colonies in essentially a primitive society. Okay, I mean, that's good, but Deneen is looking at this and saying, well, okay, it's just Singapore, but liberalism was defined in the American Constitution when they were all using outhouse, and the argument that Singapore might have something to say as important to human society as the colonies did in the 1780s, it's probably worth looking at.
And to that point, he does talk quite a bit about Tocqueville, how, when he visited the US, this is probably like in the 1830s, he went to a lot of these Puritan towns and there was higher degree of civic engagement and they were far detached from the national government. And, but that was such a long time ago. Again, can that apply in the current context with modern technology? I'm not sure. Okay, we're gonna
if you look, just one quick thing. If you look at the Mondragon co-op in Spain, and that's been going for a long time. It's very, very large co-op. Has a huge budget. Everything is worker-owned, and there are several good books on that co-op. It's not a limitation of size. I mean, Mondragon is bigger than a lot of countries in terms of its revenues and budgets. It has its own factories, own schools, own banks, own police force. But it is all, in that case, citizen-owned. Okay. So there's another example that actually was disappointed that Deneen only mentioned in passing.
Yeah. Maybe there will be a sequel to that book. Okay, there are a lot of hands, so we'll try to get to as many members as possible. I know Ralph C and Ralph S, both of you have your hand up, but I think Ellen was first. So let's go with Ellen first and then Ralph's.
Thank you. Earl, as you were presenting this book, another book crossed my mind called Bowling Alone, which I'm taking a guess you may be familiar with. Mm-hmm. Because in that book, it was a lot of the similar complaints, if I recall correctly. I read it a long time ago. But I seem to recall that the author of that book ascribed a lot of the change in society to television, that all of a sudden Americans weren't bowling anymore. They were staying at home and watching television. And so that thought crossed my mind. And these other quote unquote complaints from this author, like how citizens are now consumers. Well, can't we say that that's also really due to the Keynesian economic theory? That's an outgrowth of Keynesianism, that consumption is what drives the economy. A lot of our production is now overseas. So I suppose my first question is, his arguments that everything is the fault of liberalism, I'm beginning to question. And then his idea of doing things like in Asia. I did live in Singapore for a while, and I have a friend who lived there a few years. And I do think it's a very well-run little place, but it is a little place. It's a little place with very homogenous people, just like Taiwan is a little place with a lot of homogenous people. And my own belief is those kind of authoritarian governments with homogenous populations that are more passive are not a great solution for a large country like ours, even though I do think they do certain things well. So anyway, those were just my two thoughts, and I was wondering if in particular Bowling Alone comes to mind when you read his complaints.
Yeah, two things. First of all, there's a great deal of literature on the isolation and loneliness, and some of it is blamed on technology. And I think there's a legitimate suggestion. I think that you have to separate out the tactical from the strategic. So tactically, yes, television, video games have all contributed to the isolation of individuals. But at a more fundamental level, and this is what Deneen argues, the idea that an individual's principal purpose in life is to defend and extend their own sovereignty allows technologies like television to resonate with that intention. I'll make a side comment on Singapore. Singapore is not a homogeneous society. There are 7 major ethnic groups in Singapore.
I agree. It's very, very multicultural. It's very multicultural. I agree. But the government is very strong in enforcing that.
Yeah, you know, what I have seen over the time that I've spent there is that, and I wasn't there at the beginning. I'm not quite that old. When the founders created Singapore, they realized that they had to develop a Singaporean identity, and they were very draconian about that in the early days. But when I talk to friends in Singapore now, that's not necessary. They see themselves as Singaporean, whether they're Chinese or Malaysian or Indian. They see themselves as Singaporean, and so one of the dynamics in Singapore, and it's really well described in the Liberalism Disavowed book, is that the success in establishing the Singaporean identity in the minds of the people who live there has allowed the government to become considerably less draconian in its approaches.
But don't you think their anti-discrimination laws were very strong and enforced that?
Well, yeah, I mean, the problem that they had at the beginning, remember, at the beginning, the government, the PNP, was concerned that somebody was going to try to take them over. And as they started to grow as a financial and trade center, that concern grew. They're not going to defend themselves. They don't have a big enough navy or anything like that. It's a very big neighbor. So they had to keep internal unrest from becoming another issue, and they did that in the beginning. It was very successful, unlike the British, who I mean, British is a totally made-up nationality. Did not convince Scots like me that we're British. The Singaporean government has been very successful in building that identity, and I think it's gone a long way to making the country very successful, because in this country we have all this internal strife. I mean, everybody's yelling at everybody and everybody's mad at everybody, and there's a cost in that, the friction in that. And in Singapore, you just don't have it, and that's one of the reasons they've been so successful. As far as the size of the experiment's concerned, I think you pay attention to successes. I know the Chinese government, for instance, is studying Singapore in great detail. They're very interested in that as an alternative. The Chinese Communist Party has been on a path similar to the PNP and has been gradually easing up. And they have a strong interest in the Singaporean model. And they don't believe it's not applicable to them. They believe it may be the way for them to transition into a society with a growing middle class.
Okay, thank you, Earl. Let's go on to the next question. But before we do that, I just want to touch quickly on the role of technological advancement and how that kind of erodes society. So there's a chapter in a book where the author talks about this phenomenon known as from front porch to back patio. And what that means is sometime in the 1940s or 50s, with the advent of automobiles, people no longer, went outside for a walk, and people wanted to have back patios for more privacy instead of front porches. And I guess once upon a time, front porches where you would just kind of sit out, read a newspaper, have a beverage, and talk to your neighbors. But that went away. What's interesting there is, again, we're talking about what fuels the erosion of society. Is it because of certain consumer demand, like Ellen said, about certain Keynesian aspect of economic system? or is it something else? And I think another thing to look at is, okay, you have the consumer, you have the producer, and then you also have the government. And in this instance, I think you had the government in terms of certain planning actions or certain planning initiatives wanted to subdivide lots so that they could build as much as possible. So once you build, then people want to have more privacy. And I think, some of the government initiatives like, public roadways and making fuel, cheaply available, etc., kind of fueled, no pun intended, that kind of incentive. And one last thing I'll add to that is, you know, I mean, I guess, there's other incentives like that, whether if it's, watching television. Once upon a time, again, when you look at these old photographs, you see families, sitting in the living room with a dog watching a TV. So tying that concept to freedom, because again, Earl had mentioned before, there's different types of freedom. It's freedom from something or freedom to something. So when people are engaged in these kind of consumer-based decision making that we call freedom, is it freedom in pursuit of something, or is it freedom to shut out like neighbors and the people that walk by your front lawn, etc.? What do you think?
I'll go back to what I said earlier. Freedom from is an attitude when you are being oppressed by some external force, or in this country where you're being oppressed by the government. Now, this is the alt-right argument that the government is oppressing us. Freedom too, though, is the liberating engine for individuals to no longer, for instance, be subject to a family relationship or to a culture or to a community. So there are two different dynamics. It's simply that the freedom too has become the dominant characteristic of the children of liberalism. We've got more questions. We need to
get
and people in.
Just to underscore the importance of freedom too. I mean, there's nothing more pressing in life than whether if you want to drink a Diet Coke or Coca-Cola, right? Freedom. Anyway, little humor there. Okay, let's go to Ralph C, then Ralph S. Ralph?
Okay, thanks a lot. Yeah, I want to pick up on your comment on tradition. I think you're quite right in reading Deneen that he loves tradition, and he likes the society with its traditions and its culture, and he really wants culture, and he ties culture to tradition. But in fact, at the end, when he gets to solutions, he realizes you can't go back to tradition. Now, in fact, I think he has a bit of a sanitized history, and I think Earl did a bit of this too. When us baby boomers went off to college in the 1960s, yeah, we became anti-traditional because so much of tradition, as we knew it, was racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, and we were rejecting all that. And that was a completion of the liberalism project. I mean, there was nothing in the liberalism project that allowed Jim Crow, the culture of Jim Crow in the South, but there's nothing in Deneen's book which rejects that local culture of Jim Crow segregation in the South. He doesn't really mention it at all. So what happened, starting in the 60s with the Black Civil Rights Movement, and then the feminist movement, and then the gay rights movement, and then immigrants' rights movement, and disability rights, Earl seemed to be talking a little bit dismissively about this proliferation of rights, whereas to me, that was sort of the essence of the liberalism of the 1960s. And this was a really good thing. And we certainly don't want to go back. So this expansion of rights through the 1960s and 70s was a great progress in civilization and our moral culture. And I think at the end of his book, Deneen recognizes that we can't go backwards. The traditional culture and family structure is all gone. So what he calls for, and Earl touched on this, he's not entirely clear on it, and he's fairly weak on it, as Earl says, but he wants local cultures. But part of the nature of the culture he likes is that it is there is an enforced communitarianism. You grow up in a certain family, you're economically dependent on that family. You grow up in a certain community, you make your career there, you may inherit your father's job, but that sort of community, of course, and in a small community, you belong to one of the churches in the community. Now, he makes a big feature of religion. In fact, he wants to put the Bible back into the schools. And for many of us 60s liberals, that is anathema. So the communitarian is small local communities, say community supported agriculture, communes, things of this sort. But these are all entirely voluntary. These things are clearly going to be things that one can join and then leave anytime he wants, which is precisely the problem he has with liberalism. Liberalism has become completely voluntary and has lost any of the restrictions that have come from traditional communities. But the new communities talking about don't restrict anybody's freedom. People are, well, at least in the sense that they may have rules, but anybody is free to leave anytime they want, which isn't much different than regular society. People can stay in the communities they grow up in. They can remain in the families they grow up in, but they're free to leave, and most people choose to leave. Okay, thanks a lot.
Well, I would make two observations here. First of all, Deneen is an Orthodox Catholic who lives and works at Notre Dame University. He lives within a very compact society, and his nostalgia is driven by his life experience, just like everybody else. I make an observation on your question of the advances of right. In a Star Trek episode called Amok Time, Spock says to a competitor, I have discovered that in many occasions, wanting is not the same as having. It is not logical, but I have found it to be true. I think people who argue as you have that all the advances that occurred in protecting rights neglect to look at the second and third order effects. That those rights, and Deneen is very clear on this, those rights are being defended by a government, not a society, not a culture, not a family. And as that government has gotten more and more powerful, as more and more rights need to be protected and more intrusion, I won't argue that the advances in civil rights or the rights of any of the other groups is a bad idea, but I think it is simplistic to look at those and not consider what the cost was of those. And the cost of those was to empower a government that essentially then subsequently became a captive of the market and now is acting antithetically to the interests of citizens. You got another question there, Thomas, from somebody?
Yeah, we're going to go to the other Ralph in a second, but just speaking of some of the, I guess, advances or highlights from the, there was the women's liberation movement, and he's very critical. In fact, there's a passage in a book where he says, just because, I'm paraphrasing here, but it's something along the lines of just because women were liberated by entering the workplace, during that time period, that didn't necessarily make them more freer, in a sense that he looks at it as, well, you just simply shifted women having more like a traditional, like a housekeeper, stay-home mom, etc., into entering, quote, the workplace of capitalism. And their lives are going to be more miserable because them, just like everyone else, will now have to, serve to the corporate masters. And aren't you better off just being, like a stay-home, like a wife or stay-home mom.
Yeah,
And
yeah, Thomas, but that's a red herring. The infusion of, when you increase the labor force, the available labor force, by 50 to 60%, you depreciate the value of labor and tip the balance to capital. If you look at the long-term effect, and I'm not going to argue that women's liberation was a bad idea, or women going to work is a bad idea, but following the same comments I made to Ralph, if you are looking at the positive effects of something and ignoring the negative effects of it, then you are truly in fantasy land. And what has happened is that, okay, women entered the force, the value of labor declined, the days of a single income, whether it was from a man or a woman being able to support a family of four, is gone. Capital has gotten an ascendancy over labor, and it is also being driven by the automation, the robots, and things like that. So, you know, every time somebody extols some benefit of something happening in society, my reflex is, okay, what did it cost? And I'm not saying we shouldn't do it. It's done already. You can't put that genie back in the bottle either. But if you're looking at a society and you're not looking at the cost of certain developments, then you're missing the balance of you know, gains and losses in this thing, and credits and debits. So my response is, every time somebody says, okay, this is a great, okay, what did it cost? And I think Deneen's, he's not a good enough economist to kind of get into that. Anyway, we got lots of people waiting here, and I won't want to.
sure.
I can feel a level of frustration rising.
Okay, I do want to follow up on the important point, though. He is a huge critic of income inequality. He says that's a massive issue we need to deal with as a society. However, what I find to be very kind of counterintuitive is that the classic liberalism from the Enlightenment era came about because people did not want to be stuck in the bondage through accidents of birth. So, you know, to remove themselves, to unshackle from feudalism, there came liberalism. But then you could apply the same logic to women who want to enter a workforce because they don't want to be shackled to certain old institution of, you know, household responsibilities. And for them to then, when they enter the market, all of a sudden we have to do like cost benefit analysis or debt credit. Things like when we were doing the feudalism, you know, era, when we're coming out of the Enlightenment era, we weren't sitting around doing a cost benefit analysis. It just kind of came about. So it just seems a very kind of a counterintuitive model. But again, the book does have a lot of flaws, and I think that's one of the holes that it has. And I guess one takeaway is I think the book is very interesting because it raises a lot of interesting views on certain assumptions. But if you think this book is going to answer all the questions of all the ills of our society, I think we're very misguided. So that's a takeaway. Okay, let's go to Ralph S. and then Mikhail.
Okay, thank you, and thank you, Earl. Now, I don't think I'm really in love with this Deneen guy, but I do like.
Already married, so that's all right.
I do like the communitarianism idea, and a small point I want to raise is just about this. Then I'm gonna do a larger point, which will really continue this discussion of rights. The small point having to do with communitarianism is that Canada used to have a political party called the Progressive Conservative Party. And it was characterized by at least one political scientist there as red Toryism. And communitarianism was part of the idea. That's the small point. Now the larger point is that in this country, government intervention in terms of civil rights was absolutely essential. And you know, you had government intervention using the Interstate Commerce Clause to allow for equal accommodations for Black people who were being deprived of them. You had the civil rights legislation, which made it possible for Black people in at least southern states to actually become citizens, as opposed to having a status that was little above being slaves. So, you know, you were making some sort of observation, or Deneen was making an observation, which was suggesting that government power never has good results, and I would argue that sometimes it has very good results.
Well, let me start. Nobody made that argument. That's a straw man. Nobody made the argument that government never has good results. The argument I was putting forward is, yes, all of those things you described were achieved. But when people look at what was achieved, they don't look at the costs that are associated with those achievements. And and following Deneen's criticism, yes, all of those things happened that you just outlined. But the residual of this is that the government became more powerful and more intrusive. And then when an organization like the Koch brothers and the wealthy got control of the government, there was a government formed efficiently and powerfully able to engage in social engineering to advance the interests of the people who had captured it. Now, I'm not going to argue that we ought, I mean, I was on one of them damn buses down there in Birmingham. So, I mean, I'm not going to argue against that. But it seems to me naive not to calculate the cost. And the cost under Deneen's analysis of all of that is that the government gets to be very powerful and then eventually is captured by a strong, wealthy minority. And if you look at McConnell as majority leader, you know, law after law passed the House with vast support of the American people, and it died in the Senate. That's an example of power concentrated in Washington that is acting in the interest of the people, the major donors, who have now taken control of the government. So I'm with you on all the positives. I'm just making the point that when something like that happens, and if you don't look at the negatives, what happens is, while you're not looking at them, somebody runs in and gets control of them, and you get shafted. And that's what we're all getting right now. Thomas, you got somebody else. I don't want to wander on here. We got too many people want to ask questions.
That's okay. Just want to follow up on that, and we'll get to Mikhail next. I think the response that Earl gave, which I think kind of is along the lines of what the author says, it kind of shows you the limits of how the author views our political landscape. Again, he's saying that in the modern context, there have only been three ideologies. You know, fascism, communism, and liberalism. I think he doesn't appreciate some of the subtleties, and there could be kind of, you know, subcategories. There could be hybrid models. And if he looks at our society in those very stark terms, and if everything that the government does is always like this kind of purported, the slippery slope argument, then, well, what's the role of government? Why do anything? Just stay home, you know, shut it down.
Yeah. First of all, this is the second time to go through. Deneen is wrong on this.
Yeah.
Those ideologies are all subsets of liberalism. If you read the Communist Manifesto, if you read Das Kapital, come on, man. Those are all dissertations about how individuals can be empowered by government and the market. I mean, the idea that Karl Marx is not a child of liberalism is it's irrational. So yeah, I mean, I know Deneen did this in order to make all the Americans who read this book feel good, like we're the last superpower. All right, we were the last superpower until China, but he's wrong on this one. I mean, all of those isms that I outlined, they're all constructs within the framework of liberalism. And it's not that liberalism is the last defining one. All of the liberalism children essentially are dying, and the progenitor of them is now in its final flowering. That's what Deneen is arguing. That not that liberalism is the last one and it succeeded. He is arguing that everything that liberalism created in terms of alternative systems of organization have failed, and the mother is finally dying. That's his argument.
Yeah, just to give you a quote here, again, liberalism. He says it's the oldest and the most resilient. The other two forms of ideologies, liberalism defeated it. And some view this as end of history. I guess we've reached the end of humanity. The author is saying, no, it's a Pyrrhic victory. It's a victory that had to be won, because if the other two systems took over, or if they succeeded, we would have had such a pernicious effect for the rest of society. I think that's kind of
it. In that area, as Fukuyama is as well, he's an idiot.
Okay.
He doesn't understand what he's writing about.
Okay.
I mean, he's not. The idea that communism or socialism has died, they're all children of liberalism, and they could come back as long as a liberalism structure exists. Deneen is writing about the fact that the barn is falling down. It's all deteriorating. Anyway.
Okay. Let's go to Mikhail and then Anat. Go ahead, Mikhail. Unmute, please. Mikhail?
Unmute. You got to unmute. Can you unmute him?
Mikhail?
Can you unmute him? No. Can you unmute him? Can't you, Thomas?
I've asked to unmute.
Yeah, okay. I believe I'm unmute now. Okay. Thanks for the presentation. And when I listened to this and when I read a book, I had several comments. I don't have questions, I have comments. And I will start with terminology. In any discussion, you have to define terminology first. And I think that's definition of liberalism, which is democratic rule, which concerns about fate of minority. It's a very good one. And I don't think it's failed, first of all. So I completely disagree with the title. I think the title is wrong. And therefore, the whole premise of the book, in my view, is wrong. When Deneen starts talking about certain tendencies, he clearly shows very prominent tendencies like atomization of society, people living apart, and so on. But that's normal course of things. You can watch it, you can complain about it. The same thing is complain about machines being brought into a human's life in 18th or 17th century. So when he picks certain trends, I agree with most of them, but he emphasizes many of these trends to such an extent that to me it looks very arbitrary. And he doesn't confirm it with any such sociological data. I don't have it either, but I would argue that some of these trends, particularly atomization of the family and desire of people live as much apart as possible, that's being reversed now. I'm looking at millennials, and my younger daughter is kind of representative of this generation. I think they are more concerned about being together, and obviously older people generation even more so, being concerned being together. And so this trend, and look at reverse urbanization in the United States and so on. many trends. I cannot list them all now, but I think just picking some of them arbitrarily and enhancing them out of proportion is a very wrong approach. And the final thing is that this reversing the wrong thing could be done by education, which people do. And I think it's the best means to kind of improving society, not going to Confucianism or Communitarianism. Confucianism basically disregards role of a person. And this is very emblematic in today's Chinese society. I wouldn't want to live in such a society, and I believe very few people would want to go there. That's it. Thank you.
Go ahead, Thomas. Now Thomas is muted. What's going on here, guys? Is he frozen up?
No, I'm here. So do you have any comments to Mikhail's three-part question?
No, I mean, I get this kind of response to the book a lot. It is essentially embedded in a nostalgia, which is a fiction, which is not coming back. As far as the book is concerned, it has been incredibly impactful, and a lot of authors have taken off on his themes. It's certainly not perfect, but no book is perfect, and no book solves all the problems of humanity. That's the zero population set. But there are people who will argue that if I can't live in the illusion of my nostalgia, I certainly would not want to live in a successful community based upon Asian thoughts. The final thing I would make is Confucianism does not disregard the role of the individual. In fact, Confucianism is focused on describing what it means for an individual to be a productive and successful member of society. The two great theories in Asia are Confucianism, which focuses on how you become a productive member of society, and Buddhism, that focuses on how you become the best you can be. And the Chinese and the Asians are way ahead of us, 5,000 years ahead of us in that kind of thing. Another question, please. Let's get a question.
Hey, Anat, go ahead.
Hi, Mikhail actually touched upon my concern, sort of where he ended. You mentioned a lot of the East Asian countries. I mean, I don't know if I would lump them all together. I heard South Korea, North Korea, China, Taiwan, Singapore, and possibly Malaysia. So I'm saying this as someone who hasn't read the book yet, but I'm very interested in reading it. I really felt these, the idea of like the East Asian democracy seems to, and obviously this is one that at least elevates, if not completely disregards, individual liberties in favor of essentially social and political order. I see at least some of those governments as highly intrusive, very undemocratic. I wanted to understand more why Deneen would suggest that this is really what we should emulate.
Okay, that's a very useful question, and thank you for it. What Deneen is looking at is the rate at which the United States, particularly, is falling behind the rest of the world in all sorts of areas. Now, we're number one in the percentage of the population incarcerated, but we're way behind in terms of interconnectivity. We're way behind in terms of infrastructure development. We're way behind in terms of of education. We've got a political system that doesn't work. And so what Deneen was, he said, okay, well, let's see where in the rest of the world there are societies that seem to be doing better than we are. If you look at Singapore, for instance, Singapore has a rapidly expanding middle class. The United States has a rapidly deteriorating middle class. The Singaporean standard of living is considerably higher than it is in this country. The percentage of the population below the poverty line in the United States is massively greater than it is in Singapore. So what Deneen is looking at, he's saying, okay, wait a minute. We're driving down the road in his car and we're doing 90 miles an hour. The wheels are falling off and the engine is coughing and we're being passed by a couple of Japanese cars. What's going on here? Now, it may be that there are people who are like the proverbial frog in a pan of water. You know, you put it in when it's cold, you heat it up, it won't leave, it'll die. They will essentially not realize what's happening to the country and its competitive relationship to the rest of the world. But Deneen is trying to set off an alarm and saying, you know, if you want to engage in this nostalgia that says, okay, everything is good and everything is sweet, and it's American exceptionalism and the greatest country in the world, you can ride that thing all the way down. But Deneen is saying, no, let's try to find some ideas that might improve the future of the country. So he's actually arguing that that by looking at these alternatives, Americans might have a better life.
I guess what I'm confused about is does he legitimately believe that a Confucian approach, a la, you know, though at least those countries you mentioned can be disentangled from the problems that we do see in those places today, in terms of many of those governments are extremely powerful. There's no such thing as dissent. You can't. I echoing Mikhail's point. I know just based on small bits of footage I've seen from China, I would never want to live there. And it's not just China. I mean, I've been to Singapore too, and even just a few of the things I saw there frightened me completely. It just,
but Deneen is not focused on anecdotal evidence provided.
Of course not. Of course not. But just, I'm not basing my decisions about China and Singapore solely on anecdotal evidence. I'm just giving you an example.
Yeah, I mean, again, when Deneen looks at the results that certain other societies are getting and compares them with the results that are showing up in the American experience, he asks, what about those new other approaches that are making them successful where this country is falling behind? And so when he looked around, as I said earlier, he looked at Eastern Europe and there's nothing there to learn because they're as screwed as we are. And so he then looked at Japan and Korea and Singapore and Hong Kong and to some extent China, but he comes to the end of his book, and there's a whole nother book that needs to be written on the alternatives, and Deneen didn't write that book. Other people have written that book. He just gets to the point where he says there's got to be a better way, and maybe this is something we ought to think about. I mean, that's the extent to which Deneen gets involved in proposing solutions.
If I could take an attempt in answering Anat's question, there's really no direct reference to all these Asian countries other than it's just like a passing suggestion, very trivial kind of superficial suggestion, a reference to this notion of Confucianist communitarianism. The book is not about that at all. In fact, the book is about what Earl just said. And he's a critique of certain institutions that used to work, like liberal arts. Again, liberal arts came from the era when, during the Enlightenment era, supposed to educate the population and then advance the society. So he's a big critique of liberal arts education because it failed. And what happens when the educational system fails? You have dumbed down citizenry that Earl had mentioned during his presentation. He also talks about how social media, the ills of social media, how that's kind of replacing our behavior. And because of that, we're no longer a functional society. So when you couple all these institutional failures plus certain modes of normative consumer behaviors, it inevitably leads to a cultural decline. And like Earl said, guys, the barn is on fire. We got to save this barn because otherwise this is it. The ship's going to sink. So then the question is, when the barn burns down, well, what's the alternative? And that's where I think the author is a bit short on prescriptions. But just to clarify Anat's question, that's kind of the thrust of the book. Let's go to some other questions.
Thank you.
Aaron and then Steve.
No, thank you. And thank you, Earl, for doing the work to summarize it, because I know it's always a lot of work to do that. Appreciate the forum, Thomas, that you guys have provided. I find his Deneen's sort of arguments as so essentialist, and they are so broad, where he's focused on sort of ills in America, but then he, in essence, goes after a principal evolution, Hobbesian evolution of modern rights and of creating sovereignty and a system of sovereignty. And so, he's sort of, it seems like he's arguing kind of across almost the whole span of political philosophy, so he believes in positive rights. He's anti-materialist. He has like a Hegelian view. Choosing Singapore or, smaller states. I mean, Singapore is the size of Minnesota in terms of population. So, choosing, examples. I mean, you could take individual Nordic countries, city-states that are fantastic. But when you get to, really large states, India, United States, China, Democratic Republic of Congo, Russia, these gargantuan states, you tend to have so many externalities that you wind up having to have very robust political systems that either have a lot of devolution, which means they're just really messy, but they hold themselves together, so that you can cherry pick all day long the 4,000 things that look horrible every day and have a list for the rest of your life. And that's great, but unless you're willing to just get up and move to Finland, learn Finnish, and associate a Finnish lifestyle, which is fine, it's great, but that build the culture around that, you're really not going to get those benefits. So it's almost like he's attempting a social commentary on modernity and using all the political philosophers to sort of cherry pick a set of essentialism that he'd like to get back to or like to create. And I think the emphasis on sort of Asian philosophies, sounds great. I mean, he didn't include Hinduism, and the largest democracy in human history is in India, and it's a beautiful, messy, a process that they're on a, X zillion year journey, just like we are. I don't see, this desire to, devolve ourselves back to some sort of essentialism that's very paternalistic, that's going to involve sort of, creating our individualism. And our individualism, which can be linked to self and narcissism, et cetera. But that's also gives us all this incredible creativity, lets us be sitting here talking to ourselves. It lets us do, enormous amounts of things. And we can cherry pick that people are on social media too much and they don't say hi when they walk by. But I doubt most of us want to trade 1830s or much as 1930s, probably 1970s for most of what we have in 2020, much less what we're going to have in 2040. And so I don't see how he believes this essentialism is what anyone is really interested in mass, versus just putting out kind of a target that people can have a debate about, if that makes any sense. So,
there's a couple of things that are interesting about your comment. First of all, Deneen is not writing to convince anybody. He's not writing to convince somebody that the country is on a downward spiral. Even when he's arguing that liberalism is in final flowering, he's not engaging in some sort of attempt to convince people that that's what's happening. He's writing what he sees and understands to be accurate. And his attitude in his interviews has been, look, these are the facts as I've laid them out. This is the way it looks to me. If you want to continue on, I'm not trying to argue that you should not. He's not trying to change the minds of 300 million Americans. He's looking at it as a commentary on an experiment that started in 1685. He's essentially saying that the human hubris, that humans are capable of organizing society based on a limited set of principles that will endure forever, bring tranquility and prosperity. This was Adam Smith's argument, that tolerance was the essence of liberalism. Is the same illusion as Hitler's 1,000-year Reich. What he's saying is that the signals that I'm reading are that this experiment, because there were fundamental flaws in its logic, and one of the fundamental flaws was an overemphasis on the freedom to, the disconnect of the individual from a societal context. That the signals I'm reading are that this is starting to, really grind down. Now, as I mentioned and Thomas mentioned, he's not writing a book about what to do next. He feels obligated in the last chapter to kind of outline something of a way forward. I would observe in passing that the largest democracy on the planet is not based on the fundamentals of liberalism. So it is not a defense of the liberalistic experiment. If you look at the shifts in power, in prosperity, even in China, you look at the rapid rise of the middle class. I mean, yes, you can stay on this ship and say, oh, everything is wonderful and the flowers are blooming, but the Chinese have a rising middle class and we have one that's deteriorated. The Chinese have an expanding infrastructure and we have one that's deteriorating. At some point, the news that you're reading has to break through the mythology that you're trying to maintain. And so Deneen is kind of saying, I'm just chronicling this. This is what I see. And you can read it. Lots of authors have read it and acted off it. They've read it and said, okay, that what Deneen said is really important. And many of them then have said, okay, let me write the other book, which is where we go from here. There's a whole series of those books that are really well worth reading. Thomas, what else we got?
Okay, thanks, Earl. Let's go with Steve and then Sam.
Okay, yeah, I wanted to, I think a lot of the comments here really helped me in formulating my reaction to the book. I have read it, and I don't remember this emphasis on Confucianism, which is up throughout the discussion tonight, but it struck me that it had a lot of interesting intellectual antecedents, which he doesn't really emphasize in the book. Which I was thinking of a much better book, Christopher Lash's True and Only Heaven, which is like a 600-page or longer book about the intellectual history, the idea of progress. And that's really a similar argument, but more grounded in a communitarian, more explicit in its communitarian grounding and in the specifics of American history. This book kind of meanders because while he talks about liberalism true court, which would seemingly apply to the Western world, at least, and other nations, the few specific examples are based really on the United States, the educational system, and so on. And I agree that it would almost be better if he didn't have that epilogue where he's suggesting, potential alternatives, because he really doesn't develop them. I mean, they need more historical, maybe it's my historical training and bias, but they need more grounding and some specificity. And he's sort of forced to acknowledge that we really can't get away from all of these liberal advances and civil rights and so on. It kind of it undermines most of what he's been arguing up to that point. So it's a little incoherent. I was also struck by the fact that although he's a conservative, clearly he's anti-capitalist in a way that if you read the Communist Manifesto, the way Marx talks about utopian socialists, these sort of aristocratic, we wouldn't consider them Marxist socialists, but people who oppose capitalism and the atomization and individualism, is very similar to the themes he brings up in this book. So it's a weird kind of medley of, like Lash's book, of some historically left and historically right concerns. It's against the ultra-individualism in the market, but obviously isn't in favor of expanding the state either. So it's provocative, but I think especially with that conclusion, a much more thorough historical and political analysis is needed, perhaps more multinational, to really make his points more convincing and coherent. I don't see Earl.
No, I would simply reiterate that what Deneen was trying to do was analyze why an experiment which was designed in the long 18th century is apparently going off the rails. Mm-hmm. That's his project, and his criticism is focused on the foundational logic behind liberalism. And he's not alone. I mean, there are people who predate him. Carl Schmitt wrote criticisms of liberalism before becoming a Nazi sympathizer. But the points that he makes in those articles that he wrote in the 30s are really telling. For instance, Carl Schmitt argued that liberalism only works when things are peaceful and there are no major threats, and that as soon as major threats show up, the society moves towards authoritarianism in order to protect itself. Now, that analysis is not laid full over the American experience, but parts of it are. When you look at the idea that was embedded in Locke and Mill, that liberalism induces tolerance of the other, that liberalism posits a common good in which everybody who ascribes to it, no matter what their religion or their race or where they come from, is welcome as a fellow participant in liberalism. Deneen says, well, that's a really nice assumption, but it doesn't work. And he's not the first to say that. As I said, Carl Schmitt said that in the 30s. So Deneen's project is to critique the foundational logic of liberalism based upon historical experience from the long 18th century to today. That's what he set about to do. Now, I think his publisher said, "Hey, Pat, we've read this thing and we really like it. We're going to publish it, but you can't end up on a sour note. Could you write something at the end of this thing which gives everybody hope and reduces the chances they're all going to go out and commit suicide?" But when I read the book, I got to the point of the last part of it, and I just skated through it because I knew that he was done. He'd done his work in the prior chapters, and that was the lifting that he was trying to do. I don't know if that answers it.
Yeah. Now, I was just going to wonder if maybe he talks throughout about grounding it in, the pre-liberalism being grounded in localism, cultures, communities, whether really something like the New England meetings that Tocqueville is writing about is really the model that he would desire, but realizes is not feasible in this historical moment. But that really seems to be the closest to an ideal within a context that could be presented.
All right. Who else we got, Thomas?
Before we get to Sam, I just want to comment on, I guess Steve said, in some ways, the author seems to be kind of like anti-capitalism. And I'm not sure if that's entirely correct. What I would say is he would be in favor of capitalism in a sense that, all, rising, tide or all rising boats lift, the standards of
rising tide lifts all boats.
Exactly. There you go. That's the right expression. So I think he's in favor of that. And I think he's in favor of accumulation of wealth through hard work so that you could improve the livelihood of others. He talks about the generational thing. You pass on your culture. You also let the successive generations have a better future. I think he's in favor of that. What he's against is this kind of perverse notion of free market where a free market is just going to solve all the ills of our society, because some people do believe in that. When there's a problem, just leave it up to the free market and that'll just kind of sort itself out. And I think he's very skeptical of that notion. And again, he's very critical of this idea that, this narcissistic behavior where everyone is over consuming, and that just leads to this insatiable appetite for more consumption and production. And that, by the way, leads also to environmental degradation, which he's against. He talks at length about how dare we, just exploit everything as if everything is renewable. So he takes a more kind of balanced approach. And just one last thing I'll add is, his version of localism, I think, will certainly slow down certain levels of globalism. And I'm certainly not a defender of globalism, but there are certain benefits that we all attained through certain international trade. And I think if we had this kind of, Tocqueville's, version of America from 1830s, I think the level of globalism would have been certainly, halted at some point. And I think the standards of living would have not been as advanced as where we are right now. So let's go to Sam, then Colleen.
Thanks, Thomas. First, thanks for this topic. It's a very interesting book, very interesting perspective also. And thanks to Earl for his summary. It's very helpful and very on point on many points. I think I'd really like to note what you said about China sort of becoming more like Singapore, which is actually something that you rarely hear in the news. But it's been very much described by people like Kishore Mahbubani, who was the UN representative of Singapore for a long time, and a very good analyst of the evolution of China. So one point, I guess, on what you said about things or the idea of things are not coming back. If you look at China, sort of what China went through, the type of turmoil and political and cultural revolution from the days of like a half century of Mao, they're sort of, in a way, they're coming back. I guess China has a lot less cultural inertia by virtue of having 5,000 years of a cultural continuity, but I think maybe part of the problem is the sort of liberal mindset has been really taken by sort of the ideal from the 1960s and from baby boomers generation, and for that generation, which is kind of really has shaped American culture, American institution, there is no turning back. And there's sort of like the idea of the alternative being something like 1930s Germany, without any sort of other alternatives. And that's kind of one of the interesting things this book sort of points to, is that maybe the alternative is there. And the other point, which also Earl noted, is that the book lacks in terms of its economic sort of framework. And I'll be very curious. I think it would be really interesting if Deneen maybe looked at the thoughts of somebody like Michael Wilson, who sort of did pretty much the same analysis, but from a completely sort of economic perspective rather than cultural. And you'd find that there might be some implementation of maybe like earlier American economic system, which was based on industrial capitalism, as opposed to the current one based on financial capitalism, which really sort of has a lot of destructive impact on culture as well on the economy. So it'd be an interesting aspect for Deneen to ask whether sort of he's really explored those views. Otherwise, once again, thanks again for the talk and for the presentation, Earl and Thomas.
Kind words are always appreciated. Thank you very much. Who else we got?
Okay. Thank you, Sam. We have Colleen and then back to Mikhail. So Colleen, you're next.
Hello. Well, I have to admit at the very beginning that I have read just parts of the book. So thank you all for the presentation. I get my impression about the book as a whole is formed based on this presentation mostly. So I have couple of points to make, and my questions follow. By describing the effect of liberalism as seen by Deneen, it seems that Donald Trump is the embodiment of modern liberalism. I specifically refer to the use of alternative facts. I just remind you, winning elections, biggest augurational crowd in 2017, narcissistic personality, which believe that he is the one who defines what is true and what is not, what is true and false. So basically the belief that if you control the narrative, the truth of facts doesn't matter because the narrative is the truth itself. However, that approach is not unique to the liberalism in that particular definition as it is defined by Deneen. I just want to point that the medieval church, for example, the church fighting Galileo and Copernicus and all early scientists is a good example about the same importance and fight to control who defines what is the truth. And the second point is the role of law in the society, in the liberal society, in the liberalism itself is not spoken about, and I do think it is very essential because it's closely related to the functioning of the free market. Law in order is the underlying condition to market to function. And in the end of this, my questions are like, does Deneen address the role of law and the essential capitalistic promise, the claim that government and the king should function, should operate under the law? And the second question is, did he view or did he express his opinion whether current conservatives are just liberals in disguise?
Okay, first question. In Deneen's view, and in mine, the government is essentially the enforcer of laws. The people who control the government are the establishers of what the laws are. So in early liberalism, the idea was that it was a people's country and the people would decide what the laws were going to be, and then the government was in the business of making sure that those laws were enforced. What happened was, as liberalism advanced and the government got more and more powerful in the society, a minority of the population took over control of the government. one of their principal mechanisms that I mentioned was Citizens United. Once you pass Citizens United and you have these massive PACs, piles of money, then you can control not only who gets elected, but what the people who get elected do. And so the reading for Deneen and for me, in terms of one of the vulnerabilities of liberalism, is that the foundational authors never envisioned the possibility that capital through the free market would take over control of the rulemaking and enforcement of the government. That was not an idea. Citizens United actually inserted the market into politics. It monetized politics in the same way that the market has monetized all other aspects of society. And in Citizens United, essentially, with corporations being people, and a CEO could take the surplus of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of employees and deploy it to a particular political purpose. The My Pillow guy is a good example. Opens the door to a market definition of value in politics, and that's what's happened. As far as Deneen's analysis of liberalism, it is not a critique specifically of American society. He uses examples out of American society, mostly because he's American. But his critique is on the fundamental underlying logic of liberalism and why, like all other human experiments in governance, it has a shelf life. Eventually, it comes to an end. I mean, you can't find in China, for instance, you can't find in India or Japan, anywhere in Asia or in Europe, any constantly enduring, immortal approach to governance, approach to organizing the economy, the political and the social aspects of human society. And so Deneen is essentially saying, look, this has been a great ride. I mean, let me be the first guy to raise my hand and clap and say, oh, damn, man, in the 60s, we were just printing money. But this is coming to an end, and we need to figure out what the hell we're going to do next. We need to figure out, this boat's sinking. We need to build another one. We need another long 18th century set of thinkers who come up with another theory of the organization of economic, political, and social organization of society to point the way forward. We may be in for a kind of, if you mentioned China, in history, China, there were these periods between emperors, dynasties, where the warlords fought over each other. And we may be in a period of going into the wilderness for 40 years or however long it is until we figure out. But Deneen is saying, yeah, this boat's sinking, we need to build another one. Thomas, who else we got? Thanks, by the way, for the comment. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay, back to Mikhail, and then we'll wrap it up with Aaron. So Mikhail, then Aaron.
Okay. I just recalled one thing which you probably know about. It was because it gives all this in perspective. There was a discussion in British Parliament at the beginning of 20th century about trends in society and fate of their youth and so on. And then one of MPs goes to the podium and says, okay, let me read you something. And he reads something like this: our youth became absolutely ungovernable. They're not interested in anything else. They just, it's basically, if this trend continues, society is going to hell. And then he asked, when was this written? And there are different guesses. And he says, it was written, it was a speech in Senate in the ancient Rome.
Yep.
Yep.
Okay, and then you want to respond to that or no?
No, it's a very useful. You can pick. I mean, I have friends. We talk about the pre-Socratics, And what we realize is pre-Socratic philosophers are dealing with the same questions that we're dealing with now, and they didn't have a good answer, and neither do we to some of their questions. But you know, this is like, okay, we're in an airplane, we've lost the engines, we've gone from 10,000 feet to 4,000 feet, we're down to 1,000 feet, and one guy looks at the other and says, things are going great, we haven't crashed yet. Yeah, it's that last quarter inch that gets you. Who else do we have, Thomas? What do you got one more?
A quick note, if I may add. Maybe that's very instructive, because what happened to Rome might be happening to us in a declining empire. So, you know, it's one thing. If you look, for example, at like you know, John Globe's book on the fate of empires, you know, you find a lot of similarities in the waning periods of those empires.
I agree.
Okay, Aaron, and then we'll wrap it up.
Well, thank you. I mean, this sort of instrumentation of capitalism as sort of a novel or new thing as being central in our politics is just not square with history. I mean, you know, the first panic you had in the United States was the Panic of 1792. I mean, so you've had, and then that's what sort of secured Alexander Hamilton, because he sort of invented collateralized central banking and basically paying off debt securities to end a panic. And so, I mean, we've gone through versions of almost every type of financial or economic event that we think is novel or new in our past. In many cases, they were far worse than we've had in recent years. I mean, you know, if you read in the 1880s and 90s, I mean, you basically had basically over a 20-year period, 15 of those years was a depression. So, you know, arguably it was a bigger depression than the Great Depression. So people just don't study these things. So we believe there's sort of a novelty and uniqueness to the moments that we're in, and that it's sort of like, this must be the end of days because this is happening. But if you go back, there's a resilience that not just the United States, but, you know, many places in the world has. And liberalism, if there is a question of what isn't resilient, it really has almost nothing to do with liberalism. It has to do with the legalism and the legitimacy that you have in the legalism. And if you sort of violate that at any scale, that's where you start to run into some significant imbalances. So it's hard for me to see this sort of 300 plus year evolution of liberalism, which isn't just in a few countries, but is in some form in, 50 plus 100, probably 100 countries now. That's a sign of weakness. I just don't see how franchisement and sort of individual expression is never just going to be on the march. There's almost a natural evolution for people to have the freedom to express themselves and be themselves, not to sort of adhere to some type of communitarian system. You have the choice to do that if you want to, but that's positive negative rights. So I just don't see how liberalism is sort of the big question of what the world is sort of teetering on, or the West is teetering on, or the United States is teetering on.
Well, let me take a couple points. First, with legislation like McCain-Feingold, people who should not have an interest in campaign finance reform were being forced to have an interest by their constituents. The problem with legislation was that it was limiting the power of the wealthy to gain control of the rulemaking and enforcement arm of the government. Citizens United actually enshrined market operation in law. It actually introduced, through the decision of the Supreme Court, the market. And the market is defined by money, by wealth. So that's a major change. It had been several times, with the robber barons as an example, who spent a lot of money trying to stay in business. Teddy Roosevelt turned them back. There have been these assaults, but never as successful as Citizens United. Because in one fell swoop, they introduced the market into politics and made campaigns so expensive that if you don't dance to the tunes they're playing, they'll finance somebody else. As far as the arc of liberalism, you may argue that instead of being in the last 5% of the viability of liberalism, we are in the 75 percentile. But if you're arguing that liberalism is immortal, that is in fact a theory of political, social, and economic organization that will endure forever, based on its fundamental principles, I have a problem with that, because I turn around and ask you, okay, show me another one that has done that. And it seems to me that you default back to the fact that this is the Son of God come to earth to save us all, and he is immortal, and he's gone back to heaven, and we haven't seen him in a while. The whole point of Deneen's book is history tells us that sooner or later every experiment runs out of gas, and this one appears to be running out of gas now. And so you can do one of two things. I mean, you can party until it's over, or you can start thinking about how you could reorganize society. You could have another long 18th century and come up with a different approach that works, that saves us from this decline. The real problem globally is that the United States is not doing very well competitive. I mean, we still have some areas like the financial sector, which is essentially global, but we've got a shrinking middle class, we've got an expanding national debt, we've got a deteriorating infrastructure, we've got an educational system that's more trade school than it is an educational system, and there's other parts of the world that are well ahead of us in a whole bunch of areas. So I think Deneen's trying to set off an alarm saying, okay, we're not all going to die tomorrow, but let's assume that it takes a decade for us to figure out where we're going to go and how we're going to get out of this mess. We better start thinking about that now, because the clock's running.
Okay, so
All
before
right.
we wrap up, any final thoughts, Earl, about the book or some of the ideas?
Well, what I would recommend is that there are several books that ought to be read after you read Deneen. I've mentioned a couple of them. I would suggest you read Helen McClain's book, Democracy in Chains. It's the story of how the Koch brothers and their wealthy network have worked to gain control of the federal government. McClain is a really good historian and student of that. I would recommend reading Fantasyland by Kurt Anderson, where Deneen talks about liberalism and its underlying logic. Anderson talks about the evolution of the American mentality and how we got to where we are. The two books read in parallel are really both enlightening and frightening. Beyond that, Robert Reich has written a book called Saving Capitalism, and he's responding to Deneen by proposing that if you just tinker this one and tinker that one, we could make capitalism work for everybody. There's a whole series of books that have come off of this book in that mode. And then I would also recommend reading the Liberalism Disavowed. And if you get the slide deck, I'll send it to you, Tom. I have a list of those books on one of the slides. Other than that, I've appreciated the chance to talk about this book and your comments and your questions. So thank you all.
Thanks. And if I could just add a final comment too, since I've read the book as well. I know we were very critical about certain aspects of traditionalism and preserving the culture, but I think one takeaway from the book is that not everything from the past, certain traditions are bad. I know there's certain critical aspects of it, and I know part of the human evolution has been trying to make certain progress and improve. But I think the author's takeaway point is that certain things from the past are worth preserving because that's who we are. And he mentions culture like over 150 times because that's the essence of who we are: time, place, and what's the third thing? Time, place, and nature. And those things are almost like immutable. And if you try to tinker with that, there are a lot of dangers. And we didn't have time to get into postmodernism, but he is lambasting, postmodernism because basically he's saying that how dare you try to change certain aspects of nature because, that's, there's a whole set of implications from that. And also his criticism of postmodernism is that, look, everything happens on like a continuum. Like we are just a blip in a history. We are not here to reshape and retool who we are as humanity. We're just a blip in the continuum. And his commentary of postmodernism is that they tend to forget the past and everything is in the moment of now. And that kind of, short-sightedness is very perilous. So that's something to, keep in mind. So I think the takeaway is, there are certain things worth preserving, and perhaps we do have an obligation to then pass it on to the successive generations. The final thing, speaking of book recommendations, like I know a lot of the ideas from this book are kind of like doom and gloom, and I think he does at least do some, proper analysis of certain assumptions. But if you want to get like a whole different antithetical viewpoint of what this author does, I would recommend Steven Pinker. Enlightenment Now is pretty much like a counter to what this author provides. So it'll be interesting to read maybe that book, Steven Pinker's book, sometime in the future, and just kind of juxtapose, the analysis, who gets it wrong, who looks at it from a more, short-term perspective versus long-term. Very fascinating topic. So thanks once again, Chief, for hosting. And I guess I'll see you guys next time. Take care.
Take care now.
Thank you. Great job.
Bye-bye.